Welcome to this tutorial on creating a simple horror game in Java. In this video, we will take you through the process step by step, ensuring that even if you are a beginner, you can follow along and create your own chilling gaming experience. Before we start coding, let's talk about what our game will look like. We will create a two-dimensional horror game where the player navigates through a dark maze, trying to avoid an enemy that can chase them. The objective is to collect keys to escape the maze while avoiding the enemy. We'll incorporate randomly generated elements to enhance the gameplay. To develop this game, we will be using Java, and our tools will include an integrated development environment, IDE, like IntelliJ IDEA or Eclipse, and the Java Development Kit, JDK. Make sure you have these installed and set up before we proceed. Let's get started. First, create a new Java project in your IDE. Name it Horror Game and set up a main class that will serve as the entry point for our game. Here's how to create the class. Now that we have the main class set up, let's create the game window. For that, we will use Java Swing. Add the following code to create a simple frame for our game. Now, let's modify our Horror Game class to create an instance of game window and display it. Update your main method as follows. At this point, if you run your program, you should see a simple window titled Horror Game. It's the foundation we need to build upon. Next, let's lay out the game logic, including the player character and the enemy. Let's start by creating a player class. This class will contain properties for the player, including position, health, and any other necessary attributes. Here's how you can set it up. Now, let's create a simple method to move our player. We will add movement logic in the player class. This method will update the player's position based on the input from the keyboard. Next, let's create an enemy class that behaves in a simple manner, chasing the player. Here is a basic setup for the enemy class. Now, to get things moving, we need to create instances of our player and enemy classes. In the game window class, let's declare and initialize our player and an enemy. So far, we have set up our player and enemy. Next, we need to implement a way to display the player and the enemy on our game window. We can do this by overriding the paint method in our game window class. Here's the code. Now, we need to update our game loop to repaint the screen and move the enemy towards the player. We will use a simple loop, but first, we need to set up a timer to control how often we redraw the window. With the main mechanics in place, let's explore how to add controls to move the player. We'll need to implement key listener functionality to handle keyboard input. To do this, add the following code in your game window class. Now, when you run the game, you should be able to control the player using the arrow keys. However, we still need to create an engaging gameplay experience by adding collectibles, in our case, keys that the player must collect to escape the maze. Now let's incorporate our keys into the game. We will create a list of keys in the game window class and draw them during the paint process. Update your game window code. Next, we need to check for collisions between the player and the keys. When the player collects a key, it should be removed from the game. We can achieve this by checking their positions in the update loop. Incorporate this method into the game loop so it gets called every time we repaint. Every time the timer ticks, let's check for key collection. By now, we have a basic horror game where the player can move around, collect keys, and an enemy that chases the player. To make this more of a horror experience, let's work on the enemy behavior. We want it to become more aggressive as the player collects keys. Now, add some simple game over logic based on player health. We can create a simple method to check if the player has collided with the enemy and reduce health accordingly. If health drops to 0, the game will end. This method should also be called in the timer, and the player will now face consequences for getting too close to the enemy. We are now closer to a complete game, but let's add some ambience to our horror game. To create an atmosphere, we can add background music and sound effects. You will need an audio library like JLayer or Java Sound API. With that in place, here's how you can load and play sounds. Call this method in your game window class during initialization to play background music. Finally, let's add a simple user interface that displays the player's health and collects keys. We can draw additional text on the screen in the paint method. Congratulations! You've now created a basic horror game using Java. Feel free to expand on this with more features, such as different levels, more enemies, or additional types of collectibles. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more game development content and tutorials. If you have questions, leave them in the comments below.